Good. All right. There we are.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our the Mayor's Megawatt Challenge Electric Vehicle Charging, Battery Storage, and Electrification webinar. As you may have noted, we are recording this for posterity and for future reference. So do be aware that everything that we discuss and any questions you have in here will be recorded. We are delighted to have a great panel today and to thank our webinar sponsor, Blackstone Energy Services, for generously sponsoring this webinar, and to our program sponsor, Enbridge Gas. Next slide, please. We have a busy agenda today. We've got our welcome and introductions, then installing EV charging systems, requirements and key considerations, evaluating the performance of EV charging stations, and then considerations for your electrical infrastructure, and then of course some time for audience questions. Next slide, please. Okay, these are some of the housekeeping issues we have, and just some instructions around housekeeping. Please use the question and answer option or any questions you might have related to what we're speaking about. That should be down at the bottom of your screen. If you just mouse over, it should appear. There's a question and answer box down there, and you can answer those questions. They will be answered either they'll be answered immediately by our experts as the webinar goes on, or we will have some of those for the Q&A at the end of the webinar. Anything we can't get to will be circulated in a question and answer document after the event. And please, you can also use the chat to communicate with us, but those would be for technology questions or anything related like that. Next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce our webinar panelists. We have with us Grant MacArthur, who's the Vice President of Renewables at Blackstone Energy Services. We have Peter Lee, who's a Senior Associate at Mulvey and Banani International Incorporated. We have Christina Guido, who's the Acting Manager for Energy and Environment at the Town of Caledon. And our moderator is Frank Camilleri, who's the Vice President with Enerlife Consulting. Next slide, please. So to set the stage, transportation is responsible for 27% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada currently. So as part of the ongoing commitment to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, the Government of Canada has set a goal of reducing emissions from transportation of reducing by 12 megatons of CO2 by 2030. Obviously, electrical vehicles are a key component of this. So 58% of the goal will be achieved through conversion to EVs. So the government recently adopted a mandatory target of 100% of the sales of new light-duty vehicles to be electric by 2035. This will achieve a collaboration across a wide range of actors, including the federal government, municipal, provincial government, electric utilities, automotive industry, and other private organizations, because this will not only require rethinking how we purchase vehicles, but also how they run and are serviced and maintained. So it's a big ask and a big goal, but absolutely necessary to get to where we're going. Next slide, please. So currently this is, thank you. Currently EVs in Canada, well, as of 2019, there were 168,000 EVs in Canada, which is only a small proportion of the 25 million light-duty vehicles. There's the sales goals are targeting a 10% share of EVs by 2025, which is the next one along, 40% by 2030, and then 100% by 2040. And so in 2025, that would be about 3% of the vehicle fleet, and 11% by 2030, and 60% by 2040. Yes, this PowerPoint will be shared with everybody after this presentation, and we will also share the questions that are asked during the presentation. Sorry for that interruption. As of June 2021, there are about 6,000 charging stations with 13,000 charging outlets across Canada. So this is a big hill to climb for sure, but a number of you are already working on this, so it'll be interesting to hear from our experts to see what can be done. So without further ado, next slide, please. We'd like to hear from you. We know that a number of municipalities have already identified vehicle electrification as a key piece of your climate plan, and that you have targets to electrify either your fleets or the community at large, help electrification in the community at large. This is already underway in communities such as Burlington, where they have over 30 public stations per 50,000 people, and they're adding new ones all the time. Toronto has about half that, with 16 stations per every 50,000 people. And Ottawa is planning to convert its entire electric fleet to electric buses in the next 15 years. So Andrew's going to launch a poll because we'd like to hear from you as to what's happening in your community. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to answer that.
Just a note, there are 5 questions. So if you don't see all of them, just scroll down a bit to answer what you can.
Look like, oh no, a few more people are still answering questions. Give you a couple more minutes.
Currently have just over half of people answering them. So yeah, we'll leave it open for another minute, and then we'll publish the results.
Right. Thanks, Andrew. Looks like we've got some answers. Do you want to publish the results, Andrew? Okay, I hope everyone can see this, and if not, we will share this with you at the end of this with all the other materials. Looks like 79% of you already have EV charging stations in your municipality. Really exciting. About 16% no, and then 5% under construction. Looks like most EV chargers are used for both public vehicles and fleet. That's really interesting, really good. And I can't see the short answers, but we can publish those maybe later. And then, unless you want to speak to those after I go through question 4, Andrew. And then, 91% of you are planning to add more EV charging stations in your municipality. That's exciting. And some feedback on the short answer. So that I cannot see. Are you able to see those, Andrew, and provide some of those answers?
Yeah, it looks like we have a variety of different types of electric fleet vehicles in use, everything from Ford Focuses to SUVs, a lot of light and medium duty vehicles. And then for looking at the time frames for planning to install EV charging stations, most people are looking to install them within the next 1 to 2 years. So by the end of 2024, a couple 2025, but yeah, the large majority of them are within the next 2 years.
Fantastic. Great. So very timely for this webinar then. Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn it over now to Frank, if you want to move to the next slide, and then I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jillian. Just getting right into it, a little bit about the electric vehicle charging, the different types. So there's levels 1, 2, and 3. Levels 2 and 3 are really what the areas we're going to be focusing on. Level 1 are pretty slow chargers, but I think the ones that are most interest to municipalities and those on the call would be levels 2 and 3. Level 2, again, a lot of it as you get higher in levels, obviously it gets they get faster in terms of charging, and that's the biggest sort of focus for electrical vehicle charging, and the biggest hurdles that they're facing is quick charging, right? So typically level 2, can take between 5 and 10, 12 hours to do charges, whereas the level 3s, which are DC fast charging type, they're becoming more like they're sort of the equivalent in gas stations, if you will. In fact, that you can charge them fairly quickly, between 30 minutes and an hour. So we'll be talking more about those, but just wanted to sort of clarify the different levels. Again, we'll be focusing more on level 2 and 3 for this webinar. Okay, next slide. Let me see here. Oops, let me just make sure I got this. Okay, good. So a little bit about EV charger and installation costs. Level 2s, again, as they're a little bit slower, they cost a little bit. So this is just the equipment cost, is ranging anywhere from $8,000 to $10,000, and the level 3s, again, just equipment costs between $50,000 and $55,000. The installation cost, the reason why we have that sort of there is it varies considerably, and we'll talk more about the factors that affect that. But I wanted to give you some insight, at least on the equipment cost, and then we'll get into more of the details of installation cost variables and in the ranges that can impact that, things that can actually impact. But I'd like to start off by just asking Grant, our one of our panelists, a question regarding this. Regarding the price increases recently, especially during the last couple of years of COVID and supply chain issues. What has been the price increase over the last 1 to 2 years, and what are the factors that have been responsible for this increase? Just to put some context into things here.
Sure. Thanks, Frank. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Great. Thanks, Frank.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Frank. I would say, just with respect to the price increase, depending on the installation complexity, we've seen probably about a 30% increase, more or less, over the last couple of years.
Okay.
And the factors that have been responsible, I would say it's kind of a split between the actual chargers, where we've seen recent price increases, but also on electrical equipment, which has been in short supply, transformers, conducting wire, breaker panels, that type of stuff. We've also seen labor costs have gone up, due to inflation in general, and just other market supply and demand factors, because there's such a demand right now, or has been, for electrical work. So yeah, that's what we're seeing in the last couple of years.
Okay, no, that's great. That's very helpful, Grant. I mean, there's been a lot of increases, especially in electronics in general, especially over the last couple of years, and EV chargers is no exception to that. I mean, in fact, that's at the heart of it, right? So thanks for that, and that's useful. So kind of moving on to the next question. Sorry, the next slide here is really, what are factors that impact the charger cost? This is really the equipment cost, and we'll get into the installation cost a little bit more. So we're focusing a little bit more on level 2, but I think this is also the case for DC fast chargers. So, power output obviously is a big one. So the higher the power output of these, the higher the amp draw, which means generally the faster they can charge, the more expensive it is. Indoor, outdoor. Indoor tend to be less expensive because they don't have to deal with weather resistance, and outdoor have to deal with that added factor of vandalism, so forth as well. So again, whether they're indoor or outdoor has an impact on pricing. Portable versus hardwired. So hardwired are more expensive, so that's where the charging is connected directly into the infrastructure of the building, where portable would be ones like you plug into like a kind of a stove type of connection, right? So those tend to be a little bit less expensive. Networked or not networked is another factor. Networked refers really to stations or charging stations that actually have to deal with payment and financial transactions. So obviously makes sense that they would cost a bit more because they have to have Wi-Fi connections and so forth. And single port versus dual port. Again, the dual ports because there's more that just generally cost a little bit more to at least on the equipment costs from that perspective, right? So the moving on to the installation costs, we'll get more into a bit of a discussion on that. So again, factors that impact that are number of circuits and chargers installed. And this is where it gets into the variability of these costs. That's why we didn't quite put a range in that table we first showed. Distance between the charger and electrical, that can have huge implications. Whether it's 100 meters or whether it's 200 meters, 300 has a big impact. The building age, generally as the older the building, typically there are more changes or upgrades required in the transformer room. Typically that's the case. In terms of building modifications, so anything that has to happen to the building in order to allow the connection of these chargers to the building, it will cost. So things like trenching, for instance, you got landscaping in the way between the charging stations and the actual electrical room, or if they have to drill through concrete, those kinds of things, make a difference. They just keep increasing the cost, right? So the other one, the last item, which is probably the biggest one, is if there is an electrical upgrade required. I mean, that many buildings run into that when they get into some more comprehensive type of installation. So a question for Grant here, just to get a little bit of context for the people here. We know that that you have experience in this here, but just generally, maybe just for everyone's background here, how long have you been involved in the installation of EV charging stations, just to give some context to the audience?
Sure. It's been about 5 years since we've been doing this, as sort of branching off of a lot of other work we've been doing for different clients in the energy efficiency space. But we started doing kind of smaller installations in multi-residential building MERBs, and that's evolved into a lot more of work for public sector,
Okay.
which is we have a number of broader public sector framework agreements in place. OECM is one, the Ontario Educational Collaborative Marketplace, where we're nice to be a platinum supply partner there for EV charging and installation. And but more recently, you're seeing from the poll there, there's been a lot of work in the MUSH sector, with our largest installs coming in higher education space, hospitals, and we've also been doing some really exciting consulting work for municipalities.
Oh, okay, great. No, that's great. So I mean, you've got quite a few years under your belt in exposure to different sectors and ones that are very relevant to the audience here, right? So
Yeah.
the public sector. So just expanding on that, based on your experience, what additional factors that really haven't talked about in the slides that already impact the price of the installation of level 2 and level 3 chargers? Mm-hmm.
Sure. I'd say the thing that's threaded through everything is it's a lot of his electrical labor has been very interesting recently, in that the volume of electrical work and EV charging work amongst all other, there's just been a ton of activity in the space that it's exploded, so that the overall quality we've seen sometimes, or experience of the electrician in the market, has been a little diluted. And that can lead to additional labor, and for us it's led to additional project management costs to make sure we're doing well by our clients by managing the subs properly. But that's a big one. It's hidden inside of the global supply chain and logistics disruptions we've seen, and then another one I think would be just inflation. It's everywhere. It's impacted EV charging as well, and the demand for charging is up just so much over the past couple of years, and doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. So we'll continue to see inflation probably as an issue.
Yeah, no, that's a great point that you bring up. When you have this kind of a shock, this huge demand and spike for this kind of activity, I'm sure the last couple of years, especially probably most recently with the war in Ukraine and gas prices spiking up, I've definitely noticed in my research a lot of increase demand for electrical vehicles. Just they're that much more cost effective to operate as well, right? So that's helpful. And yes, inflation, obviously, that's just a factor of that as well. So thanks for that, Grant. And just over to you, Peter. Again, similar questions. How long have you been involved in the installation of EV charging stations? Just to get some context and similar questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've personally been involved with the EV charging projects for over 8 years now.
Great.
At Volvo and Benani, we've always prided ourselves as looking forward into what the new trends are, and we always study what's upcoming and kind of prepare for it. I think as LEAD was kind of coming into looking into EV charging and giving it credits and things like that, that was when some of our developer clients have really started looking at things more seriously. And I think about 8 years ago was the first project that we started designing EV charging stations. And at that time, it was maybe just a handful of stations, right? But in anticipation of the Tesla Model 3 basically coming into production in 2017, a couple years before that, everybody was basically saying, you know what, these mass produced lower end, lower costing EVs are now in the market. We better be ready, right? So I think it was around the 2015, 2016 time was when, most projects that we're designing are looking into EVs. Basically, every single project was looking into installing them. And in the past 5 years, every single new build is looking into EVs. It's just a matter of how many. So we've definitely been heavily involved in this sector.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Thanks, Peter. Yes, it has evolved. You're right. I do remember when the Model 3 first came out, there was a huge increase, especially a vehicle that's more affordable, if you will, because the Model S, when it came out, it was pretty expensive. So yeah, I could see that triggering a big change and a big demand for this. And again, similar question to Grant. Based on your experience as well, what additional factors that we didn't mention and Grant hasn't mentioned that impact level 2 and level 3 costs that we haven't really discussed about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think you guys pretty much covered most of it, but I will talk a little bit more to a couple more points. So relative to level 2 and level 3, I mean, at level 2, predominantly, we are looking at 3 to 7 kilowatt type of chargers. And then at level 3, as you get into 20 versus 50 kilowatts, at that particular range, you're almost looking like for most facilities, you're almost looking at certainly to upgrade your electrical infrastructure. And that's when things start to get more expensive, right? Do you have the space to put that all in? So that level 3 charging station, that definitely is a huge factor. It's not just a matter of the chargers being more expensive, it's the power infrastructure associated with it. And along with that, when our clients are looking at level 3 chargers, they're typically looking at selling a lot more electricity. There's going to be a lot more electricity consumed. So deciding on which charging network to go with, there may be different commissions, different service fees associated to different networks. Those could be a deciding factor. So depending, when you have a level 2 charger and you don't have that many of them, that might not be a huge deciding factor. But as you start to get more level 2 chargers and getting into level 3, that starts to play a bigger part in the decision making.
Thanks for that, Peter. That you bring up a really good point. I mean, you're right. Once you go from level 2 to level 3, there's a factor of 10 almost that you're talking about in terms of electrical requirements in terms of kW. So we will show some actual data from charging stations that Kaladin and Christine in particular on the panel has shared with us, and we'll share that information with you. Is that even though the usage may not necessarily be extremely high as a percentage of the building per se, but the actual draw greatly impacts the electrical infrastructure. And so yeah, a big decision whether you go with level 2, level 3, and that big jump, almost certainly, as you mentioned, Peter, and we'll get into a little bit more, will require some electrical upgrade in some fashion. And that's where the cost really can go crazy, right? So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Thanks, Peter, for that. Thanks, Brent, for your responses to that. And just continuing on here, when installing EV charging, some of the things that we wanted to highlight to keep in mind here. So, some marketplace observations. I think we've touched upon them a little bit. Talking about the initial phases of EV charging a few years back versus what's going on now. I guess question for you, Grant. Again, maybe you can expand a little bit more. Given your 5 years experience, what have you observed when these things were first being installed versus today, more recently in the demand increase for it? Mm-hmm.
Sure. A few years ago, really what it was, just installations where we're using up, capacity that's available in the existing infrastructure. So looking at very minimal infrastructure upgrades and hopefully not a lot of civil work. So we're trying to build against the outside wall of an adjacent, of an electrical room that's hopefully next to a parking lot, and just trying to put the initial chargers in to start out a network. I kind of call that like a phase one type installation.
Okay.
And then you're putting some charging in at as lowest cost possible. And then for much of our client base now, we're sort of moving into what I guess you'd call a phase two, where you're starting to design and implement larger volumes of EV charger specific electrical infrastructure and performing civil works to put the chargers in a different location so they can be expanded upon and move more easily into a phase three. And phase three is when you're starting to really dose into DC fast charging, 50 kilowatts and that type of stuff or higher, with more and more number of level 2 chargers or fleet charging. And so we're starting to see this type of phase 3 type install now at some unique locations. We've had a very interesting install at Brock University with 4 level 3 chargers.
Oh wow!
We've also been performing some vehicle to grid trials at Brock and also at Fanshawe Georgian colleges. So it's happening. The EV sales, as we talked about, are growing, and demand management and the intelligence required to manage the different equipment types and loads is starting to be required too. Although we're still well behind, very progressive jurisdictions like California.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Yes, again, just reiterating, if I understand correctly, is that again, initial stages, we're trying to work within the existing EV charging infrastructure and noticing more and more. And I think this is consistent with what Peter's saying as well. Is that as you get more comprehensive with these EV charging, which is you're seeing more and more of, you're looking into likely upgrades to your infrastructure. And that's kind of what the next 2 points really sort of said. Do they need a separate service or service upgrade?
Yeah.
Because, and you're starting to see more and more of that. You're encroaching that almost in nowadays, especially as you're getting into more comprehensive, and especially again, as you both highlighted, the requirement for DC fast charging as well. So that's becoming the norm. Again, I'm a proud owner of an electric vehicle charger, and I look for those DC fast charging because of that. They save time and so forth, right? So I could see why the demand is going up for those, and so we'll see more of that. Typical time frame for this from planning to install ready for use. Typically we understand it takes from 1 to 6 months for these phase 1 and phase 2 deployments, but things can be considerably longer if infrastructure change is required, and we'll get into more of that. And that is very, very site specific. Once you start getting into infrastructure upgrades, and we'll talk more about that in the coming slides. But that's basically that's kind of just a general feel for the audience regarding the typical timeframes for typical installations that don't require huge infrastructure upgrades. So just moving on to the next one. So trying to get some perspective, especially from municipalities, and this is from Christina. Christina's given us some good tidbits here about how do you determine your EV charging requirements, so community needs assessment, municipal fleet considerations, and policies. So Christine, welcome, by the way.
Hi.
And, great to have you here. For the audience here, what advice would you give to municipalities that are trying to determine where to locate them? I mean, we saw from the poll that many have some already and are considering expanding them. But yeah, what advice would you give them? I know that Caledon's done quite a few of them as well, but it would be great, to get some insight from you on that.
Sure. Yeah, I would say to look to where the EV charging requirements are in your community. So for example, are there any geographical gaps within the community, maybe a village or a town that's underserviced with EV charging stations, that can help prioritize where you install. Also looking at where it makes sense to have level 2s versus level 3s. We've targeted like major roadways, major highways for our level 3 charging stations, but maybe at our community centers or close by to conservation areas where people are spending more time to look at the level 2 installs. In regards to your own fleet, even considering if they're parked for long periods of time overnight, do they even need a level 2 charging station? We've just extended plugs, so I guess the equivalent of a level 1 for our bylaw vehicles that are EVs to free up those EV charging stations for the community at our town hall locations. Even looking beyond your own geographic borders, we've partnered with the region of Peel, City of Brampton, City of Mississauga, our 2 local conservation authorities, and we made a regional zero emissions vehicle strategy. And there are actions in there to look collectively as a whole for our region where EV charging stations are required, and building more of a methodology in that selection of where we locate our EV chargers. And also, yeah, on the policy side of things, at our town hall building, we're seeing now a lot of demand for the charging stations, and we're getting into challenges where there's not enough charging stations available for the demand in this community. So that's where you might not want to start looking at policies, maybe setting maximum charging times for staff and designating certain chargers for staff versus for public use. And yeah, just to keep in mind, if you are applying for grants for EV charging stations, most often there's a requirement to have a network station. So just keeping that in mind when you are speccing out what types of stations you're overseeing. And it's also important to have those conversations about maintenance of the stations. Who's going to be the first point of contact if the public should call the municipality and notify that a charging station might be down? And just making those clear roles and responsibilities.
Okay, no, that's great. There's a lot of information in that, like you said. I guess determining, probably excuse my first comment about level 1, 2, and 3. I guess where it makes sense, level 1 might be fine, right? Might be fine because where you're saying where vehicles in communities are parked a lot. And that's good because that can significantly affect or reduce your requirements in electrical infrastructure. Some great insight in terms of like where to locate these. Like you said, near like the highways or major roadways, you would think maybe the DC fast charging might be something that would be more appropriate. But where there's, like you said, there's municipalities, and I know that where there's community buildings, maybe again lots of activity going on there, you'd have the higher ones. But where there's fleets and things like that, where cars sit a lot, it would be a little bit different, maybe lower requirements and things like that. So yeah, a lot of factors to take into consideration, and we'll touch upon the some of the incentives that are out there. And you're right for highlighting the smart stations, because that's generally a requirement for that. So just a few more questions for you, Christina. You've had to deal with many installations of these. What's your experience been? Did you have many issues with these and just operation and maintenance of these? What's been your experience?
For our first generation level 3 charging stations that we installed back in 2016, unfortunately that station has failed. So recently we've had to remove that station, and we're going to put in something a bit newer in hopes of overcoming those challenges with that station. But so far I think it's been pretty manageable on the maintenance side of things. We are connected to a live website where we're notified where there's outages, and usually our facility staff, when it's located at their facility, they'll go out and they will handle what the issue is that needs to be resolved. If it's something more complex, we do call an electrician to come and help us fix the issue there. But really the main pain point for us has been that first gen level 3 from 2016.
Yeah, and that's quite a long time ago, and I imagine a lot of those issues are being or have been dealt with the newer generations. But yeah, it's something I guess to be mindful of. Anything new coming out on the marketplace, it's understandable that they're going to have some bugs in it. But again, it's 6 years from now from then, so I'm sure a lot of
Yeah.
that has been dealt with. And yeah, you talked a little bit about maintenance as well, so that's something that's to be mindful, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Just regarding your specific situation at Caledon, do you still have EVs in your municipal fleet? And if so, just again, people probably may want to know what kind of vehicles you have, because that's always a good question that people have, right?
We do. We have 4 plug-in Volts, hybrid Volts right now. We
Okay.
also have 3 Chevy Bolts full electric, and we have some more on the way.
Okay.
So that's being used by our buildings and inspection staff. We do have a corporate green fleet strategy that outlines our fuel transition plan. Definitely a lot easier with the light duty and some medium duty fleet, but a lot harder on the heavier duty fleet side of things.
Okay, that's helpful. Yes, and I guess EV charging for public employees still free. I guess we understand there used to be a lot of that in the past. And what's the current thinking on that, based on more recent trends and so forth, and where Caledon is thinking, where they're thinking on this?
So far the direction is we'll continue to offer our level 2 charging at no cost. For level 3, we just recover the cost of the demand charges for the facility. So we currently charge 20 cents per minute for our level 3 chargers. But I think unless direction changes at upper levels, we would like to keep our level 2 free.
Okay, that's good. That's interesting. Yes. Okay, great. Okay, so thanks very much for that. Appreciate that. And so just continuing on here, regarding some operational considerations. Again, just regarding the typical lifespan of this equipment, it's typically 10 years. I know we haven't had too much experience with this because the EV chargers haven't been around for much longer than that. So, but that's just to give people some context about that. Annual maintenance typically isn't a lot. Level 2 chargers really have very basic charging, and I guess same thing with maintenance. But I wouldn't mind, Grant, just from your experience in respect to lifespan, does the whole unit need to be replaced? What, or certain components? How is this normally dealt with? And what can they do, if anything, to extend the life of the charger?
Well, in the 5 years in the space, we've been lucky in that we haven't seen really any need yet to swap out any of the units. It appears that going forward, the lifespan should be about 10 years. The systems right now are built pretty ruggedly, so should survive a good long time. I often use the analogy of, you don't do it, but you could probably take a baseball bat to a lot of these. But the biggest threat to sort of needing to swap them out or change something, I think, is more of a requirement for higher charging rates.
Okay.
Should we start to see larger EV battery systems? But in terms of maintenance and just functionality, though, they're cellular connections usually for most of the chargers, and it's a good thing in that software updates can be done and performed over the network, over the air, so to speak.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So yeah, very little on the maintenance side, which is great. I mean, I'm sure municipalities are happy to hear that. And yes, and I guess lifespan, remains to be seen. But again, there's not really much moving parts and stuff. So the expectations is that they would that last around 10 or so years. And you're right, just like everything with technology, it probably is more of a technological thing that will cause the change to happen if it starts to not meet the requirements of the community more than the actual equipment failing, right? That's good to know. Is there much of a difference between level 2 chargers and level 3 chargers in terms of maintenance?
I would say previously the answer would have been yes. As level 2 chargers, the systems now going forward are pretty elegant. They're pretty static systems.
Okay.
No moving parts, generally speaking. So maintenance costs should be very, very low. So you're looking at checking of cables and that type of stuff, and making sure things are being held together properly, which is they're robustly built, so it's not an issue usually.
Okay.
Performing a test charge, these are some of the maintenance issues, but or items that you would perform. With the level 3 chargers, it used to be you'd open up the kind of the window, and it's a bit of a rat's nest in there in terms of integration.
Yep.
But things have gotten a lot more elegant in terms of the design and integration of level 3 systems, at least from what we've seen.
Okay.
So they're getting a lot more refined, and the unplanned maintenance activities are decreasing a fair amount.
Okay.
I'd say the only difference really might be there's a coolant or something like that you might want topped up on a level 3 charger that we see going forward. They're moving in the right direction, and hopefully minimal maintenance going forward for those DC fast chargers.
Okay, great. Yeah, I guess that's hopefully in line with what Christina's already back in 2016. She had some problems with it, a lot of unplanned, probably maintenance and issues with the first DC charging level 3 stations, but hopefully seeing less and less of that as the technology becomes a little bit more refined. Which so thanks for that, Grant. And that kind of brings me a question to Christine, I guess, regarding you've obviously installed level 2 and level 3. Just trying to, if you could share with us what maintenance Caledon has performed on its chargers and your current stance on it. Mm-hmm.
Well, the facility guys would definitely know better than me. I'm a bit removed from the maintenance side.
Sure.
I think what I've heard most of the time is if a breaker goes out and they just have to flip the breaker on and off, and that usually resolves the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we don't do regular maintenance if I understand the process correctly, and it's more just as issues arise, we will resolve the issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Yeah, again, in any case, it's not huge maintenance requirements, even if you decided to have a sort of a service agreement, if you will, as Grant mentioned. So again, and hopefully it's getting better and better, with the unplanned services, because these charging stations are becoming more and more reliable. So thanks to both of you, Grant and Christine, for sharing that. Just getting into this is a little bit more of the exciting part, where how can you help fund your EV projects, which is great. So we know there's a zero emission vehicle infrastructure program from Enercan, and this table here just provides a bit of a summary. You can see here the different levels in the of funding that's available, and you got a bit of a separation there for Indigenous communities as well. I won't get into all of these, but as you can see here, as the fast chargers, you can see there's 4 rows there talking about that, and it really depends on the size, basically, and how fast you can do that, and obviously the cost goes up rapidly between those, right? So, but this would be of hopefully interest to many of the municipalities, and which really is my next question for Grant. I know, Grant, you've been heavily involved with these grants. Maybe you can provide some insight to the audience in terms of, like, when is the deadline for the next application? Our understanding is that there's several rounds of this that occurs, and I think one just happened in August, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The ZVIP website, it's actually got a pretty decent calendar describing what's happened and what will happen.
Mm-hmm.
So as it stands right now on the website, it's saying that the next application uptake window is in January.
Okay.
So just a couple of months away, and they typically have about a 3-month uptake window. So that would close, I guess, in April.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Okay, good. So yeah, so it's not too far away. Something to think about, those on the call for sure, if you're planning something fairly recently. And again, this is funding. I know that typically in our discussions previously, Grant, that funding has generally been, in the past had been covering up to 50%, but we're seeing with inflation and increasing costs, it's becoming a little bit less. But still, it's still material, and it can impact your financial implications of installing these. So Grant, just a little bit further on this, what lead time is typically necessary to prepare for this application, given your experience?
Yeah, I think it's always tough giving a runway, right? Because people just tend to kind of move to the end of the runway. But I think it's good, knowing now, for instance, if there's a January window opening, probably in the next month or two, you just want to start determining the scope of work.
Okay.
And starting to get a good understanding or estimate of the installation costs. It's always good to, because of proposals and budgets and getting sign off on stuff. It could always good to start a few months early.
Sure. Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah, we know that some things, some things just take a lot of time from an approval perspective, and especially if you haven't really been planning much for it, then the sooner the better, I guess, right? So you're well prepared for these applications. And I mean, some of the what are the key items that you would highlight that would you should have decided and ready for the application process, so that people keep that in mind as they're planning for this.
Sure. And I think Peter had mentioned it a little bit earlier, but where are you going to place the chargers, of course, is a very important one. Where in your parking area, what electrical rooms are nearby, or will you need to be modifying? What type of civil works will be required? And, probably most importantly, that was, what's your budget? What can you get done inside of your budget is what you're trying to determine.
Mhm.
And you also want to be considerate of those internal approval timelines, so that you have adequate time to get a sign off for the budget.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, no, great points for sure. And I know a lot of this can't necessarily be resolved in this, so some of this hopefully would have been started beforehand, at least having some discussions. And from the poll, it sounds like this has been in the planning for a while for many municipalities. So hopefully this won't be a huge hurdle. But yeah, the sooner the better, I guess, is generally the guidance I'm hearing. I think this is always a question that I like asking. What's the success rate of this program? People sometimes get a little skittish about, am I going to get funded? What are the odds of getting funded and so forth? But based on your experience, what has that been traditionally, based on your experience, and any tips for successful applications?
Sure. For the public sector, I think a lot of the focus is trying to, push us towards the public sector.
Okay.
So the success rate has been pretty high,
Mhm.
so long as you're accurately and robustly filling out the different sections of the ZVIP application,
Yep.
and if you've been considerate of the work involved. So,
Mhm.
so I mean, it's gone pretty well. Shamelessly, I'll say, best tip for a successful application is to work with Blackstone. But um, joking aside, there is, aside from the ZVIP, actually, there's some other interesting funding opportunities that are emerging. And that's one through is the Canadian Infrastructure Bank.
Yep.
And this is for very large scale infrastructure implementations
Mhm.
that require like significant electrical and civil upgrades at multiple locations, like service upgrades for sure, and really robustly filling out your infrastructure for large fleets and this type of thing. And
Mhm.
we've been starting to work with the CIB and some of our client base in that regard. So it's coming. It's getting pretty exciting. So yeah.
Oh, that's great. No, that's great. No, that's great that there's other opportunities as well. I know that Life has worked very closely with CIB. In fact, we're one of the technical advisors there. So yeah, there's definitely that's another area to be looking at, especially when it comes to technical infrastructure, which can be very costly. They have some really good rates, financing rates available there as well, right? And yeah, and I guess general guidance, if I can hear you, Grant, is it'd be good to get some help from someone who's experienced at filling out these applications, just to make it easier and improve your success rate. I think that's probably a good recommendation. So thanks for that.
Welcome.
Christine, I guess just because I know that you've actually installed a few of these. Have you applied and received funding for any stations already installed? And if so, what was that process like?
Yes, so we worked collaboratively with the Region of Peel and the Peel Region area municipalities and conservation authorities in a joint application. So we've done that through our collective that we call the Peel Climate Change Partnership. So we worked collectively on climate action as a region. So luckily in our situation, the Region of Peel kindly offered to be the lead applicant on these grant applications. So on
Yep.
our end, we just have to pull together our detailed project information. So we had to have those discussions on location, what charging types we wanted to put forward, what
Mhm.
budget we could put towards it,
Mhm.
and just some of the electrical upgrade requirements for it, reaching out to the electrician to get an understanding of what the cost would be for those electrical upgrades.
Mhm.
So far we've been very successful in applying as a partnership. The town has participated in 2 successful rounds of ZVIP funding, and I know as a partnership they've had more outside of the ones that we've been involved in.
Okay.
So yeah, on our end, it's been fairly not so much a resource intensive process because the region took on that role of being the lead applicant for us.
Okay. No, that's great. That's great to hear, and encouraging that Calvin's been very successful at getting funding, right? Partnered up, sure, with the region of Peel, which obviously has reduced the load on you for completing these applications. But I think the end result if nothing else, is that you're getting the funding, right? Which is great. A high probability of getting funding, right? Which is fantastic. So that's great to hear. Mm-hmm.
If I could just add one more thing, sorry, this
Yeah.
also inspired us to have a recurring budget line that we put forward to council. Our facilities team they're the ones who oversee it, but we realized we were missing out on opportunities not having that 50% requirement of budget. So we've put it in as a standing item so that we can participate in these collective grant applications. It's part of a broader corporate energy grant line, or sorry, budget line that we have. So if we don't participate in a grant, then we'll invest it in energy efficiency retrofits.
Okay, no, that's great advice. Yes, as opposed to it being ad hoc, right? And saying you're going to do it if you have funding, but you still need the remainder, the balance of that. And so that's great advice, Christina, for all those in listening in, to actually have it as a recurring capital item. So that's great. So thanks again for that. So great opportunities here for funding, be it this CVIP as well as CIB, and any other future ones we can see. I'm sure there's going to be other ones coming out as well. So take advantage of that, right? Next slide here, just talking a little bit about understanding a little bit about the profiles. Calvin and Christine in particular was very kind enough to share some of the usage trends in there. So we've got a couple here. We've got one charging station, a level 2 charging station at Caledon Town Hall, which is used both by the public and municipal. And this is basically average weekly usage over the pattern. You can see here, it's not, again, from a consumption perspective, it's not huge, but you can see the level 2 charging, peaks around 160 kilowatt hours per week, and that happens in the summer. And there's a DC fast charging one, and you could see no real surprises that it gets used more because it's faster, and it hits around the 400 kilowatt hours. Again, just some noticeable patterns, that DC fast charging gets used more usage off of it because it charges faster, but also that, which is not big surprises, is that there's more usage in the summertime. People are traveling using their vehicles a little bit more. But one comment that would be, I'd like to comment on, I guess, and Christine, I guess you can when you answer this, I'm sure it'll lead to that, is that do you have any strategies for managing EV loads in sub-metering? We talked about these. They don't look like huge loads, but what's been your experience, and what's been Caledon's position in terms of sub-metering it and just tracking it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for us, we haven't noticed on the building's consumption overall. We monitor all our buildings using RepScreen Expert. The performance analysis, we give out energy performance reports to our facilities biannually. And I haven't noticed a huge impact on the facility energy consumption. So we don't have plans currently to sub-meter or do any energy load offsets for our EV chargers at this moment. That might change in the future as we add more and if we see that impact on our facilities. But right now we just use the networking information available through ChargePoint to monitor the consumption. But I will say it's very loosely monitored. We don't pay so close of an eye towards it.
Sure. And that's been, the experience that we've had when we've looked at some buildings and where it has been sub-metered. So far, again, like you said, I think these early stages anyways, it's represented typically less than 1% of the annual consumption of the building. So it hasn't been a big deal. And as you commented, that might change going forward, so maybe that'll be something that you look forward to. I mean, the good thing is that with a lot of this funding, there's a requirement to have it all kind of sub-metered anyway, so that'll likely be a part of the equation anyways going forward. It'll all be tracked very closely, and you can see as it becomes a bigger part, especially as EV charging becomes more and more popular. But again, so far, I mean, based on current trends, it's not a huge significant implication in terms of consumption. Forget about, put aside the electrical infrastructure, because consumption and the draw in the building are two separate things. But and again, just some trends that, DC fast charging obviously is going to get more uptake than your typical level 2 charger. So again, thanks for sharing that with us, Christine. We have another slide here, just showing, again, probably similar patterns to what we showed in the previous slide. This is basically all the 5 stations, the charging stations that you shared with us, and you can see the the magenta ones there, which are the DC fast charging ones. You can see here the average daily usage of it, and again, no surprises that the magenta seems to be the highest typically of all of them, fast charging. And again, overall, they're not huge in terms of average daily usage, but again, that's a per charger station. And then I guess as EV charging becomes more and more popular, we're probably going to see, maybe that might become a little bit more significant as part of the building energy consumption, right? So something to keep in mind too, as well, when you're thinking about these things, about the implications that this can have. Again, similar patterns is that you see the summer pick up the average daily usage as people begin to do day trips and things of that nature, right? So again, this is a good information. Just wanted to share with you the implications of, if people haven't really felt or understood the kind of implication energy it would have on your building. But again, from a consumption perspective, right now it's not a big deal, but something to think about in the future. Infrastructure is a totally separate issue, though. Great. So thanks for that. Let me see here. So just other considerations that when you're investigating, EV options, basically anytime you're into any infrastructure upgrades, it's really important because of the cost and the time it takes to consider any upgrades. We recommend highly that you look at the long-term picture of electrification in general. It sounds like, again, just from Grant's discussion and Peter, the uptake recently is becoming more and more onerous on the electrical infrastructure. And again, even in low carbon in general, which certainly is where the municipalities are headed, is going to become more and more common. And again, when you look at this, don't look at it just for your EV options. Look at it for your full solutions, which includes how much you want to get off of gas, for instance, and other goals like solar PV going to be there, or district energy going to be a part of the equation. But instead of looking at it just for EV, look at it for your whole comprehensive needs, because this process is quite extensive. I'd like to talk about get into this a little bit more. The electrical infrastructure, we kind of danced around about it in terms of that it can vary quite a bit. So just some of the things that want to highlight, what's the process when that you would undertake to investigate electrical infrastructure upgrades, as this has been a little bit not well understood in the marketplace. So one of the first steps is really to engage with electrical and mechanical consultants. They help determine electrical peak needs from both mechanical and electrical systems, and then help understand your current building electrical room infrastructure situation and future goals. So Peter, I know this is a lot of the work that you work in this space here. Could you elaborate a little bit more for the audience on the scope of work that the electrical and mechanical consultants usually revolve around or get involved with when they undertake this type of investigation?
Yeah, so nowadays when net emissions, net zero emissions is a really big thing. And what does that mean for a facility? What that means is basically eliminating natural gas for the most part, right? So by eliminating natural gas, you got to look at where your sources are. Your natural gas sources could be hot water tanks. It could be your kitchens, right? It could be humidification within your facility. So what that means is, instead of using natural gas, we'll be using electricity from the grid to supply it. So what happens is a mechanic will have a discussion between the electrical mechanical consultant with the end user. Will determine what the goal is. What are we trying to achieve? If we are trying to achieve net zero emission, then mechanical, we will identify as consultants basically everything within this facility that causes emissions. And then we would go in there systematically and seeing what that would entail and what pieces of equipment we need to convert to electrical. And then what would happen, that would start with the mechanical consultant. They would look at those pieces of equipment. And then electrically, what we would look at is what is the infrastructure required to support the additional electrical load. So once we've established what equipment, what those loads are electrically, then we can start looking at the existing infrastructure and looking at whether or not we need to upgrade. Do we just upgrade a panel board, a transformer, a switchboard, or do we even need a service upgrade in some instances? We've looked at a hospital that went full electrification. We're in the process of designing one right now, actually out west. With the climate changes that they're experiencing out west, this is a major driver in electrification. And just simply the humidification alone was 1 megawatt. That is huge for most facilities, right? So that would entail you to go investigate, do I need a service upgrade?
Yeah, no, this is good. Yeah, thanks for expanding and elaborating a bit on the roles of both the electrical and the mechanical consultant. As you mentioned rightly, is that as we do go and aim towards zero carbon, you got to pick the buildings that you want to do that. You're obviously very challenged to do that in every building because it can be fairly costly. But they have a clear role in helping to identify the electrical requirements that will be there as well. And then again, taking it to another level is how can they reduce those requirements? Where if you do want to go into electrification, where we talk about things like heat recovery, how can the mechanical and electrical consultants work together to say, okay, where can we scavenge heat so that you can reduce the electrical heating requirement, right? So that's going to form a big part of the equation, and that's why it's important to engage with the electrical and mechanical consultants early on in this. And as Peter mentioned, as many of these will require electrical infrastructure upgrades if it's very comprehensive EV and electrification that the municipality has in mind with that specific building. The process typically starts with involving the LDC, and this is where it gets very variable in terms of the cost. Is that the LDC requires design investigations to determine, okay, how do we get that additional infrastructure? If it's needed, how do we get that to the building? And a design deposit is usually required with the utility company to investigate that. It's typically, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge charge, typically $10,000 per megawatt, but just something to be mindful of. And I guess this kind of tied into, maybe you can elaborate, based on your experience, Peter, having been involved with this process here, both the LDC's role in all this and what they do and the things that impact timeline.
Yeah. So at the beginning of the project, I mean, first, like, we need to establish what kind of incremental load increase that we need within the facility, right? So that will take maybe like 2-3 months for electrical, mechanical to kind of come together, figure out what kind of increases we're looking at, whether or not that all of this planning fits within the owner's budget, right? 2-3 months to start the process. And then if we deem that a electrical service upgrade is required, that's when we will engage a LDC, a local distribution company, right? And they will then, after the design deposit, they will investigate their civil infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, in order to determine what upgrades they need on their end. Because like most facilities, you're sharing your circuit with nearby buildings. Most facilities don't get their dedicated service, right? Because you typically cannot exhaust one circuit worth. So what they need to do is, one, check your wire size to see how much your neighbors are drawing, whether or not there's spare capacity on that circuit. If not, do they have to upgrade the wiring? Do they have to upgrade their pad mount switchgear on the boulevard, those little green boxes that you see? Whether or not they have to upgrade in downtown Toronto. For many, many years, we're having very, very high demand. So they even have problems at the substation side with transformation, whether there's breaker spaces available
Mhm.
at the substation end. So all of those things, including anything from manhole capacity, duct bank capacity, all of that has to be investigated from the LDC side. And
Mhm.
that process could take 6 months, it could take 8 months. So
Mhm.
that is probably the longest part of the entire process, because you don't really know how
Mhm.
much investigation needs to happen. And
Mhm.
sometimes a local utility could come back with a plan and say, this is what we think we need to upgrade in terms of our infrastructure. One of their departments puts that together, and then after further review, they're like, you know what, we think we might be able to do better. And then they go back and re-engineer that. So there's a lot of engineering and investigative work that's involved on the LDC. And that's where the design deposit kind of comes in hand,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Like you put in some money so that the LDCs can do some investigation and engineering on their end to see how they can meet your needs.
Okay, okay, great. No, thanks for that, that big background and really just justifying and clarifying why you have this wide range of potential costs associated with infrastructure, because it's very site specific and it's how that building specifically sits within the grid in the LDC. And again, that can be a very long process. So just again, managing people's expectations is that, give yourself enough time if that's the route you're going to go, that this part could take a long time. And there's a big uncertainty with that, and because it's so site specific. So again, clarifying and understanding why that range can be so, in terms of both timeline and costs, to get this upgrade completed and put into your book. So thanks for sharing that. It's very helpful. Again, I wish we had better answers in terms of being able to contain costs, but it's that uncertainty because of the whole bunch of reasons that Peter just mentioned and Brent just mentioned, that we can't really give you a range, but the process is there in terms of trying to figure out what that is going to cost. I mean, this is the process you would follow, and give yourself ample time to go through that process is basically what we're suggesting here. So thanks, Peter. Appreciate that. Peter was kind enough to, this is the stuff he lives and breathes, and created a bit of a checklist of the things to consider when you're doing EV charging and just electrical infrastructure upgrades in general. Understanding, the utilization. I think there was some interesting comments, Peter, in our discussions that you mentioned. Hey, can we share some circuits? That can have a big impact on costs. What are the goals that the actual specific you want to have for that specific building? What standards are you trying to meet? Again, we talked about this already, understanding not just really so much just the current and future EV charging. I mean, for sure, that's, as you can see, that's taking off, but also everything else, right? Is the building planning to be off gas completely, right? They're very much related. And again, once you get into being off gas completely, huge implications, just like the DC charging has huge implications. The being off of gas has huge implications on electrical infrastructure. So be very mindful of that. I want to stress again that sort of second last bullet there. There's an important play here in terms of decarbonization, where heat recovery will be a big factor in trying to minimize that electrical heating requirement. There's a lot of heat in a building that gets thrown out in the winter, that just because of its temperature or whatever reason, it just gets exhausted, just based on how we operate buildings, how we operated buildings in it. But it's transformational change is really needed in terms of how we view throwing away heat. And now there's a lot of good technology out there in terms of high temperature heat recovery chillers that can actually get that heat and make it useful to use within the building, so that you minimize any supplemental heat, and that in turn will minimize if you decide to go off of gas, that minimize the electrical heating that's required. So again, just want to stress that. And again, a lot of these low carbon plans, especially in community centers, you'll see that solar PV is an option to help out with reducing carbon. And those are all factors that you would want to consider when you're looking at your electrical infrastructure for future needs, right? So good. Let me see here. Yeah, some of the things that that impact costs. Like a lot of this is I think been talked a bit about, the amount obviously of the electrical infrastructure that's needed. We talked about the fact that it's very site specific. So Again, the earlier you can, once you know what your needs are, the earlier you can retain your LDC to do that investigation, the better, because that takes time. And again, we just stressing again, that the cost ranges quite considerably depending on those factors there. So, but I'd like to talk about something that that I think a lot of people have been, talking about these days. And this is more just some trends that we're noticing in the marketplace. And again, a lot of this is still very uncertain given where we are at with at least Canada is with EV electric vehicles and so forth. So generally, Enercan, our understanding is that batteries, at least EV batteries, are being considered. Whether or not that ends up being something in reality, but are slowly being considered as potentially a good peak provider. Again, we're still at the very initial stages here, particularly for fleets or large parking lots where vehicles are going to be parked for long. I mean, a lot of work needs to be done in this area, and then again, Enercan is doing a lot of research on vehicle to grid initiatives, and this is where I'd like to invite Grant. I know that you're doing work a lot with Enercan right now. Maybe you can give us some insight on trends from the car manufacturers regarding these trends that are at least being evaluated and considered as potentially part of the solution, or for helping the grid out in terms of open to discharging their EV batteries. What's your observation these days regarding that?
Yeah, there's some change afoot. For quite a long time, the trend is for discharging has mostly been around CHAdeMO-based systems, or systems that have that sort of DC fast charging capability. And there's very few vehicles that have that in North America. It's the Nissan Leaf and the Mitsubishi Outlander, and there's been a number of trials watching the discharge out of these vehicles for some time now, because they're the only vehicles that have that onboard infrastructure to allow for discharge.
Okay.
The main North American DC charging technology is CCS, combined charging system.
Yeah.
And the firmware for that has finally been developed that allows for the discharge.
Okay.
So it's going to take some time for EV manufacturers to load and incorporate this firmware into their vehicles, but that's a major milestone. And the Leaf actually is going to change its North American DC fast charging technology to the CCS. So we're starting to see that come on board now, and you
Okay.
see some really interesting commercials from Ford with their F-150 showing how it's vehicle to load, but the mindset is changing there quite a bit.
Okay, good. Yeah, I know we're at the early stages of that piece, and I know that it's good to see that at least manufacturers are starting to consider this, which is great. Again, I know we're at the early stages of how this sort of fits into the big equation of things. But in particular, I know that Blackstone is doing a lot of work with Enercan on this V2G initiative that you're working on. How are you currently experimenting with it? Maybe you can just elaborate a little bit of how how that project is going.
Sure. So the V2G project we have with Enercan is working on not just kind of demonstrating the discharge, which has been demonstrated several times, but it's the main thing for us is creating that transactive platform where we're calling in V2G capable EVs to a discharging location. And this is when provincial electrical demand is very, very high. And the system operator, the IESO, is looking to reduce grid demand. So we're notifying EV drivers through an app, a smartphone app of the peak, and then calling them in on a reservation system to discharge their EV batteries for a certain length of time. And then the really interesting part is then rewarding them for that discharge. So we have developed a great enterprise to grid edge device management system. I actually kind of brought it up there on the Q&A. It's our Black Pack system, which is able to command and control the discharge using certain parameters such as depth of discharge requested, or rate of discharge, or time of discharge. You don't want to leave anybody in the lurch, not being able to get back home from a discharge event. So we kind of see the EV as a future mobile power generator to help reduce grid demand. And the fascinating thing of the current study is the social aspect, is trying to figure out what will be an adequate incentive for drivers to to park their car and allow the discharge to happen for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, so, sounds like really interesting, interesting investigative and research that you guys are doing. Not just, like you said, it's the technology to be able to notify and make this happen, but the social aspect is an interesting one, right? I mean, yeah, because it's a mindset change, and again, with all this range anxiety too. People have that concern. How do you deal with that? And I know we're kind of at those initial stages, at least from a social perspective on that piece of it. But it's good to hear that at least there's initiatives going out there with Enercan kind of leading the way, that they're experimenting with it. They're not waiting to the last minute to start to consider if this could be a part of the solution. They're starting to at least have discussions about it and make technology available to find ways that can make it a part of the solution. I know we talked about EV vehicle batteries, I guess, for testing purposes. And again, maybe you can just expand a little bit on that and the vehicles that you have that you've been testing on for this. You mentioned the Leaf, for instance. Is that something that you guys are testing on right now?
Yeah, it primarily it's the Leafs and the Outlanders.
Okay.
And from a testing standpoint, the discharge aspect is it's fairly well known. And so we've seen several of demonstrations. Really, I guess is probably the best way to describe it, is you're demonstrating the discharge. That's a very viable and has been demonstrated several times. We're more focused on the remote control of the discharge and the development of that transactive software.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Okay. So, if I understand correctly, you're saying the technology is out there in terms of DC charging. Again, adapting a common standard platform, like you mentioned, CCS is one good step towards that direction to standardize things. But the technology is there. It's that the concern isn't that; it's more the social aspect and how do you deal with that whole aspect of it. And then again, this kind of leads into like what incentives are currently being considered to motivate the EV driver to want to discharge and power to the grid.
So that's the crux of everything, right? So cash is king. And so what's Ontario's it's funny, sometimes you're in your own backyard and you don't realize how unique it is. Ontario's a very interesting place. We're focused on what the IECO refers to as Class A facilities. So these are Class A customers, and these accounts have enormous, huge economic incentive to reduce demand during certain peak times in the province. The potential, so much so that you can eliminate or dramatically reduce what are called the global adjustment charges. And this global adjustment charges can make up 75 to 80% of a large user's commodity charge on their bills. So
huge.
So then the idea is reduce it for the facility, which can be, millions of dollars. And then how do we share those savings with the EV drivers, right? So it's fun. Ontario's a really very unique place to consider deploying V2G.
Yes, exactly. I know we're at the early stages of this, trying to socialize it, but you're right. Again, each jurisdiction will have its own motivations to do that. And you're right. IESO with Class A, who knows how long that'll be in place for. Again, it's a bit political as well. But yeah, definitely. Right now, the Class A, the way it works, obviously, is one where you try to reduce your demand, and then there's huge cost savings associated with that. And if there's some way of sharing that with the actual EV vehicle owners, again, that could be the start of a discussion anyways of does it make sense? Would people want to do that, right? So that's great. That's interesting. And Peter, just maybe your take on that too. Again, we're at the early stages of this, I think, but it's just interesting to hear different people's perspective, especially both of you have quite a bit of experience in this field. So Peter, if you could just share some of your thoughts, that'd be great.
Yeah, so we've done feasibility studies on basically how to mitigate global adjustment factor costs with batteries and other power producing sources within the facility for probably 5-6 years now. So we've done a number of studies. And I think the main thing is, if you, in most of our facilities where we've seen there is a substantial payback and substantial incentive, is if the existing facility already has some sort of asset, basically to reduce their peaks and peak shave, But if they don't have it and they have to add infrastructure, it still seems like with the, basically the construction industry on fire and being so busy, right? The cost of putting in additional infrastructure is still on the high side. We're in Ontario, like no matter how you cut it, our electricity costs are nowhere near what Europe is paying, and some of the other countries around the world, right? So the incentive there is definitely not as substantial as some of the other jurisdictions in terms of peak shaving. And our time of use policies, like the difference between nighttime versus daytime and when you would charge, right? So those costs would have to be, differentiate themselves a little bit more. And EV costs, battery costs, we know for sure is going to keep declining, right? We don't see that kind of cost going down anytime soon. So I think it's just more economics in terms of when it would basically be economical to deploy these EV batteries, because it's not cheap to basically store a 1 megawatt worth of batteries and inverters. It's basically a 50-foot sea can, right? That's the types of space you're looking at. Batteries are very, very heavy, even with lithium ion, right? They release toxic gases when they catch on fire. So there's a lot of implications to deploying these EV batteries. So definitely everybody is looking at it. Definitely large customers, especially large customers with other types of power producing sources. Everybody's looking at offsetting global adjustment factor costs in any way that they can. So we'll just have to wait for the battery costs to come down and see how the ultra supercapacitor tech and fuel cell tech comes as well, and how those are being matured in there and basically mass produced. Then we can see how the future, what other ways there are in order to mitigate these peak demands.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I know we're at the preliminary stages, especially from a social perspective, on how to deal with this, and that's good. And then again, yeah, if there's any way to to make it socially and technically feasible and attractive, these people have electric vehicles that they've already invested in the batteries. To your point with Class A, I totally understand. We've done a lot of analysis that installing storage batteries for the purpose of just Class A alone doesn't make sense right now given cost and economics. But yeah, definitely. But definitely, with those that have vehicles, if it can work economically, socially, and so forth, that they're already paid for, then that's just one avenue to look at. You're right, and this is just we're at the initial stages of this. But thanks both to you, Peter and Grant, for sharing your thoughts on this piece here and all the questions that we've asked. And I know Christine has left us, but I think that's been great. I think we're nearing the end of the webinar. Here's some, I guess, I know there's been some questions. Jillian, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, there have been a number of questions, both in the chat and in the Q&A. Grant and Peter have been wonderful in answering all of them, because there have been a lot of them. Okay. So thank you very much for answering that. There have been some interest in RFP examples for fleet electrification and for design, build, operative EV chargers for municipalities. So I think that's a bit of an open question to participants if they know of examples out there. Grant has some suggestions around helping with that as well. For everyone, I believe, can see that the Q&A, so that's out there around how long the chargers last, considerations for asset management. So lots of really good questions. We will be sharing these as well in a document. Just trying to see if there's anything in the chat box. I think there was a question. There was a question from someone around timelines. Is there anything around time? There's a lot of concern around timelines and goals for implementation, because there's some really aggressive targets and pressure around installation and length of, like, how long the chargers last. So it takes a year to install them, but then are they going to last for a long time? And can you upgrade or retrofit old ones to new ones. Grant and Peter, do you want to talk about that generally? Because that seemed to be a recurring theme. Grant, do you want to start?
Sure. Just there's a couple different questions there. I guess similar to, the larger and more complex the installation, where you might be running from an internal electrical room through a building, across to a certain parking spot. Working with a hospital right now that needs a service upgrade. So yeah, I mean, you're best to be planning for, several months. You want to be kind of thinking in this kind of a bare minimum of 4 months if you've got a really proactive utility and municipality that would be working with a client base. But it can get into the 6 to 12 months, particularly for service upgrades if they're significant and depending upon how quick the LDC might be to respond. But so I think that was one of the questions. And then I don't know if Peter wants to chime in as well, but just in terms of kind of older equipment, one of the big changes is that in the pricing you saw earlier in the presentation is we're kind of looking at smart or network chargers. You may have a very well functioning level 2 charger that's not network, which means you can't, there's no billing option. So we do know some municipalities where there's these kind of open to the public, I shouldn't call them dumb chargers, but they're not smart. So, and they're seeing, hey, our electrical bill is skyrocketed in this location. So people are using that location as free charging and using it sometimes 24 hours a day. So it's those units that are probably almost for certain needing to be replaced. But in terms of upgrading, I don't want to hog everything here, but Peter, maybe if you want to talk about upgrading some of the smart systems to other smart systems.
Yeah, so I see like the older systems, if you have I don't want to call it dumb system, but one of the more older chargers, I think one of the easy things that you can do is you can upgrade them with the new types with the SIM cards, because that will automatically allow you to monetize that charging station. I mean, you'll have to pay a monthly fee to get your cellular SIM card to be plugged in, but you can get on the ChargePoint network and then you can start selling the electricity and then you won't be giving away that for free, right? And then the other thing that you can look into is, again, bringing in a data drop is probably one of the things that you can do to it. And that will allow you to immediately upgrade and network them. Because networking your chargers is a huge advantage and it will allow you to deploy so many more chargers as opposed to being capped out, because you don't really know per charger how much power it's going to draw at any given point in time. So it'll help you manage your electricity usage much better.
That's great. That's great, Peter. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Grant, for that. That piece. And you're right. The DC charging, I know that's generally been an understanding that monetizing that is going to be the norm, right? And that can help maybe pay for some of the infrastructure too. I guess according to Caledon and Christine, what she was mentioning is that in their policies, I mean, so far, anyways, level 2 have generally been free. That might change going forward. You usually want to have the option, right? And for sure, DC charging, because it is costly to do. There is a commerce aspect to that that could help offset costs, the heavy costs associated with that in the long run, anyways, right? So okay, good. Jillian, I know we're kind of nearing the end of the time over here, and I understand that I've been sort of moderating. I haven't really looked at the chat and questions, but I know that typically we will, any things that haven't really been answered to the fullest extent, we will definitely do our best to answer those, and then send that out to when we send out the webinar to the registered registrants here, right?
Yes, we will. We'll send out a Q&A document that will summarize this. It was quite a lively chat. Lots of back and forth. I think Peter and Grant have spent lots of time answering and providing great answers to the questions. Hopefully they were all answered. But yes, we will send that out along with the recording when at the end of this webinar, probably in a couple days. So with that, I think we don't have anything more particularly.
I just wanted to highlight this. Yeah, this last slide, I think we included for upcoming events and initiatives. Yes. If you want to talk a little bit about that. Or?
Sure, absolutely. So the Mayor's Megawatt Challenge has its annual forum the first day on November 16th. virtual. Everyone's welcome. And our second day will be November 23rd, which is in person and members only. We are also working on a cohort project for indoor swimming pool facilities with indoor swimming pools for MMC members, looking at applications for funding through FCM to complete and submit. And we'll be starting this cohort project in 2023. This follows a really interesting project for those of you who are new to the Mayor's Megawatt Challenge that we did for arenas in previous years and with great success. And the report from that should be posted on our website. Certainly we did a number of webinars that spoke to some of our findings in that. So believe that's it for this. Thank you everybody for attending. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Catherine. Really appreciate all the questions and the engagement. It's great to put one of these on where we have a lot of conversation and a lot of good questions. Hopefully it was helpful to everybody, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Okay, great.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Peter.
you.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks for bye.